spirit in the Willard predated the building. If she's the ghost, why did it take her so long to come back? Cold spots, the scent of perfume, phantom footsteps, water turning on, lights turning off. Louise is truly a vengeful spirit and wants her inheritance back from the Willard Library. Is the Gray Lady somebody else whose connection to the Willard Library has yet to be identified?
Thank you all so much for coming to the first annual Gray Lady Tea. May we have many, many more. So I do want to thank everyone who contributed and all of you for participating and showing up and being in the spirit, if you will. Dr. Tamara Hunt, who is a professor of history at the University of Southern Indiana. Among her many achievements, lately she's best known for a couple of classes that she teaches, Social History of the Ghost and Social History of Murder, right up our, right up our alley. But she, in recent years, has become a bit fascinated with the Carpenters. I think that's fair to say, Dr. Hunt. So we have a very special presentation. Who is the Gray Lady of Willard Library? And I'm going to let Dr. Hunt come up and take over.
All right, first I'm going to tell you that, yes, I am fascinated with the Carpenter family because what a dysfunctional family we got going on there. Well, first of all, a little, as a way of introduction, I don't know how many of you are actually familiar with paranormal investigations and things like that, but I do want to let you know that those who study the paranormal believe that ghosts return for different reasons. It might be to complete unfinished business. It might be because they just like being in a place that they've been in life. Or, of course, there is the dark side, somebody who's coming back to seek vengeance for something done to them during life. Well, the Gray Lady of Evansville's Willard Library is the most famous ghost in town and in the region, I would suspect. And in fact, she is well known outside of Evansville. You may not know this, but there are GhostCams in this library that run 24/7. So if you ever want to go in the middle of the night and you're not doing anything, go check out the GhostCams and see if there's anybody here. She's also been the subject of paranormal television shows. So they've had paranormal researchers who appeared on television. But the question of who she is and why she's in the library continues. Nobody has answered that yet satisfactorily. And I'm going to look at some possibilities today, but I'm not going to say that I guarantee that my conclusions are the correct ones. Okay, so first let's look at the origin story of the Gray Lady. And I chose this one because this is a pretty standard account. In the early hours of a cold morning in 1937, the custodian went to stoke the furnace when he saw a lady dressed in a long gray gown with a great gray veil over her head. In a few versions of this story, however, the date is given as 1936, and some stories also say that after this guy saw her, he either quit immediately or he quit later after he'd seen her a number of times. So we don't actually have, at least I have not been able to find any contemporary accounts of this story. But I suspect it might be because Evansville had other things to worry about in 1937. In 1937, of course, they were still in the throes of the Depression, but that was the year of the Great Ohio River flood that took place in January and February, and it caused massive destruction here in Evansville and all along the Ohio from Cairo, Illinois to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Now, the library escaped flooding. The Willard Library was not flooded, but they did lose 500 books because the homes of their patrons were flooded. But I found this really interesting. According to a report in the Bulletin of the American Library Association published in March of 1937, the Willard was the only library in Evansville that was not flooded. So this is the one place that escaped it in terms of libraries. But of course, the devastation in Evansville was widespread, and it would take months to recover, so I suspect they didn't have a lot of time to spend worrying about the Gray Lady. Now, I have done an extensive search for any kind of published accounts about the Gray Lady for the next 50 years. And one of the earliest that we find is this account from 1985. But this account tells us that people were talking about the Gray Lady because somebody came to investigate her. So obviously someone was talking about the Gray Lady, and it looks like the librarians were well versed in what the Gray Lady did on site. In 1985, Ed and Lorraine Warren came to visit the library. Now, you may recognize their names or you may not, but even at that time, they were very famous paranormal investigators. And one of the ones that they are most famous for today is their investigation of the Perron family in Rhode Island. If any of you have seen any of the movies, The Conjuring, that's them, okay? So, Lorraine Warren claimed to be a psychic, and she declared that the spirit in the Willard predated the building. Now, in this particular newspaper account that you see here, Don Baker, the director of the library at the time, was reportedly relieved that she had found a ghost here. This newspaper report cites him as saying that the worst possible results from the Warrens' visit would be if they declared that there was no ghost here, or that they had forced the Gray Lady to leave. Although Baker said he'd never had any ghostly experiences, he also said that, quote, having ghosts is wonderful because of all the little things you can blame on them, end quote. Hey, any of you who have cats or dogs, you'll recognize, yeah. Okay, Indiana folklorist Wanda Willis has more recently added to that story of the Gray Lady predating the library by claiming that the ghost was a woman who was disappointed in love and drowned herself in the Wabash and Erie Canal. Well, being the researcher that I am, I thought, well, where in the world is the Wabash and Erie Canal? So I went and looked it up, and on this map you can see it goes right by where the Willard Library would ultimately be built. So I went and looked. Can I find this woman who committed suicide by drowning herself in the canal? Nope. I found lots of people who committed suicide, but they usually shot themselves or poisoned themselves. I didn't see anybody who was reported to have drowned themselves for that. And in fact, the only drownings that I saw were men. So I don't think that this is a reliable account. It seems unlikely that the ghost is a woman driven to commit suicide by love in the period before the library was built. And I will just add here, I have read probably thousands of ghost stories now because of my interest in it. And it is really, really common for authors to make stuff up.
It's getting too loud.
Here is an example of stories that add details about the Gray Lady for dramatic effect. These 3 online stories identify the Gray Lady as Louise Carpenter, the daughter of the library's founder, Willard Carpenter. The first source, from River City Weekend, claims that when Carpenter passed away, he left all his money to the library and his businesses, and that Louise later sued the library, claiming that her father was of unsound mind when he funded the library. That actually is true, as we're going to see. She did file a suit of that nature. She lost the case, and according to this story, she supposedly haunts the library until she gets what she is owed. The second quote, from a site called Book Riot, declares that Carpenter bequeathed his fortune to the library rather than his children, and that his quote-unquote estranged daughter, Louise, was quote-unquote furious about the way that her father's fortune was left. So her suit against the library to get her inheritance back, which was unsuccessful, made her even angrier. But the third quote adds even more dramatic detail. While acknowledging that Carpenter was a businessman and a devoted public servant, and he did serve in the state legislature at one point, he had, quote, nothing to do with his own 3 children, end quote. And he told Louise, quote, she would receive nothing when he died, end quote. It goes on to say that he left all of his money to public charity, and the library in particular served as a, quote, bitter reminder to his family that he loved the city more than them. Well, as a historian, I can tell you it's always very risky to attribute emotions and motives to people in the past unless they specifically tell you. And even then you have to ask, are they making this up? Because why would they tell us that they did it for this reason? So anyway, these authors, I think, are tending to make up these details just for the sake of drama. So in order to make my case on that, I need to tell you a little bit about the Carpenter family. First of all, it is untrue that Carpenter disinherited Louise. And there's a very specific reason for being able to say that. He died intestate, which means he left no will. So he didn't leave his money to anybody, whatever money there was. Under Indiana state law, the estate of a man who died without a will was to be divided between his wife, she got 50%, and his children, who got 50%. So this means that Carpenter's wife, Lucina, received half, and Louise and Albert, the two surviving children, received the other half. But how much estate there was to leave is actually open to question. In testimony in an 1879 lawsuit against him, Willard Carpenter testified under oath that he was nearly penniless and that he owed his wife and his son tens of thousands of dollars. On the other hand, he also testified that his wife owned a considerable amount of his property. And I have to say, I think he transferred the property to her to protect it from his creditors, but I can't prove that. But he had gone so far as to sign over to her all of their household furniture, because under the law, the furniture was his, but he specifically gave it all to her so that nobody could come and take their furniture from them. Now, because he died intestate and that Louise would share in his estate, whatever size it was, it may be that the promise of this inheritance led Louise to file for divorce only a month after her father's death. And I mean, it was almost exactly a month after he died. Now, this is an unusual step for a prominent woman in the 1880s because divorce often carried a social stigma with it. But a newspaper article that announced the filing for the divorce was really sympathetic to her. It stated that this was only making official a breakdown in the marriage that had existed for some time. The newspaper went on to say that Converse Clement, yes, that is her husband's name, Converse Clement, he had not lived in Evansville for 2 years and that he'd been unable to support his family for the past 7 years. So Louise's suit claimed that she had been basically penniless all that time. And after she filed this suit, she and her unmarried daughter Ruth gave up their home on Cherry Street, which as far as I can tell is not there anymore. The streets were renumbered, but I think that it's not there anymore. In any case, she and Ruth moved in with Lucina in the family home. Now, in order to get his wife to sign up on the transfer of real estate that funded this library, she had to give up her marital rights to the property. So that's why she had to sign off on it. Willard Carpenter had transferred to his wife's name other real estate that he valued at $100,000. But from a surviving letter by their son Albert, written after his mother's death, it appears that the real value of this property was less than half of that. So instead of $100,000, it's only worth $50,000. Albert claimed that his mother had contacted the library trustees in an effort to get them to sell her properties for a nominal amount so that this would make up for the shortfall in the amount that she had gotten from her husband. Apparently, the trustees ignored the request, and Albert renewed them in 1885 after she died. This means that Louise's later demands on the library were not the first made by members of her family. Her mother and then her brother had also made these requests. Now, when Lucina died in 1884, a year after her husband, her will left substantial bequests to her children. If her husband died with no will, she left a 3-page 24-clause will when she died. She left a number of bequests to her children and grandchildren, to her brothers and sisters, other relatives and friends, charities, all kinds of things. But I will say this, these were all dependent on the proceeds from the sale of her real estate. And real estate prices go up and down, so we aren't sure how much was actually realized from that sale. Her will forgave $6,000 that Louise owed to her mother. This family apparently loaned each other money all the time and signed notes for it. So either they're really smart or they're really money hungry. I don't know which one it is. The money that she owed to her mother included liens on real estate that Louise owned. So she had her own property. Her mother gave her specific items of furniture and an additional $4,000 in cash. Now, if that doesn't sound like a lot of money, in today's money, that would be about $120,000. So it was a nice chunk of change. Now, it is, however, possible that Louise didn't receive this amount because Lucina's real estate might not have been worth what Lucina thought it would be. So we can't be sure how much she actually got. So as I've said, Louise wasn't the first member of the family to seek some repayment from the Willard Library Board of Trustees when she filed suit against them in 1896. And this, in fact, wasn't her first effort to try and get a larger share of her parents' estates. In 1886, Louise, her brother Albert, and their nephew, Willard C. Keller, all joined in a lawsuit attempting to assert a claim to a part of the Union Block, property at 4th and Division Streets, which was being considered as the site for the new courthouse, and in fact the new courthouse was built there. Apparently, Lucina Carpenter had a claim to this property, and her children were pursuing it, along with the executor of her estate. A judge dismissed their claim in 1887 and ordered them to pay the costs of the county in defending the suit. So every time she went to court, it was costing her more money. But clearly, it was Louise's lawsuit against the Willard Library Board of Trustees that would later lead to speculation that she was the Gray Lady Ghost. Her suit was filed in Vanderburgh County in 1896 and alleged that Willard Carpenter had been flattered and persuaded to give the donation that established the Willard Library, and that these people had played on his desire to leave a name for himself. And this newspaper article you see here, he was insane on the subject of perpetuating his name. So that's the charge that was made. In October of 1896, her attorneys successfully appealed for a change of venue. Apparently, they considered that they wouldn't get a fair hearing in Evansville. And I don't know if it's because of the prominence of the trustees or people like the library, but for whatever reason, they transferred it up to Princeton. There was really extensive testimony during the trial about the life and character of Willard Carpenter. There was 600 pages of trial transcripts and another 100 pages of depositions. And most of it focused on the state of mind of Willard Carpenter and his interactions with his family. Much of this depicted a miserly man who had little time or affection for his family. His own brother stated that Willard was often, quote, unwilling to provide for his family as a father ought to in many respects, unquote. And he told the story of a time when Albert Carpenter was a boy, and his uncle A.B. Carpenter bought him a new cap. When Willard saw this cap, he said it was too expensive and that A.B. needed to take it back and get a cheaper one. And A.B. was like, well, it doesn't hurt you. It's my money. I want to buy him the hat. And Willard said no, that he had to have a cheaper one because that one would be good enough. Willard's brother also testified that both Louise and Albert had their schooling curtailed because of their father's miserliness. He said that Louise had been sent to school in Ohio, but had returned home because her clothes and possessions made her too ashamed to stay. And I do want to say we have to take a lot of this trial testimony with a grain of salt because there's a lot of money at stake here, and I'm not sure how much we can rely on some of it. Louise's ex-husband, Converse Clement, gave a deposition in which he said Willard Carpenter's treatment of his daughter was inhumane and that he offended her often by acts and words. He also testified that Carpenter had threatened to hit his son with a chair, and Louise herself testified that, quote, I have seen him catch my mother and punch her until she was black and blue, end quote. However, Louise was the only witness who said that Willard Carpenter physically abused his wife. And again, we have to bear in mind that there was a lot of money at stake in this case, which may have influenced the testimony. Louise Carpenter lost her suit in the Gibson County Court, as well as her appeal to the Indiana Supreme Court. She appears to have been experiencing financial difficulties. She did have to pay all the attorney's fees for all of this. And in 1900, she was sued for non-payment of a bill of over $150 at a local dry goods store. But she still owned real estate, because in 1906, she was sued for non-payment of real estate taxes. So she clearly still owned it, even though she owed money on it. But by that time, she had moved to the East Coast, where both of her daughters lived with their families. Louise spent the last years of her life primarily with her daughter Ruth. Ruth was a very wealthy widow of a prominent theatrical producer, and the two of them became charter members of a group called Women of Indiana and New York. Ruth had an apartment in New York City and an estate on Long Island, so Louise likely lived very comfortably in her last years. She died at the home of her other daughter, Lucina Burton, in February 1908 and was buried in Raynham, Massachusetts. Okay, so how likely is it that Louise Carpenter is haunting the Willard Library? Consider that she moved away from Evansville at the end of her life, that she lived in comfort once she did, or even luxury considering her daughter's wealth. And she seems to have found a new life on the East Coast. Furthermore, consider this. She'd been dead for 30 years before anybody ever sees the ghost. So if she's the ghost, why did it take her so long to come back? She could have walked, I suppose. A second factor to consider is the nature of the alleged paranormal phenomena. These include things like cold spots, the scent of perfume, phantom footsteps, water turning on, lights turning off, books and chairs moving on their own, so things like that. But if Louise is truly a vengeful spirit and wants her inheritance back from the Willard Library, why isn't the haunting more in keeping with the idea of an angry ghost? Wouldn't she want to see patrons so frightened that they wouldn't visit the library? As far as I've been able to tell, the only person who might or might not have fled the library because of the ghost is the guy who saw her in 1937. So, anyway. This is a point about the nature of the Gray Lady that has been made by library employees. If they believe in the haunting, they say that they think the ghost is friendly. Margaret Myers served as children's librarian here for much of her 50-year career and often described the phenomenon linked to the ghost. She even believed that the ghost followed her home and stayed with her in 1980 when the library was being renovated, but then came back here when the renovations were finished. In an interview in 1999, library assistant Sandy Feltz described stories told about the ghost. And she said some people had suggested that she was a woman who lost a child and visited the children's room because she was waiting for the child to come back. Some said she was a woman who died soon after the library was opened and loved it so much that she never wanted to leave. However, Ms. Feltz said that she didn't believe the library was haunted by Louise because she thought the ghost was trying to protect the library, not hurt it. Given the types of harmless activity attributed to the Gray Lady, it seems more likely that one of the longtime early librarians was returning to the place where they worked for decades. And you guys from the Rice Library, you have my permission to go haunt the Rice Library. Okay? There are several likely candidates, and I've given you the names of two here. Mary Otilda Tilly Gosley and Catherine Imbush are the most likely candidates. The dates you see here show when each of them worked at the Willard Library. Both Tilly Gosley and Catherine Imbush served as head librarian, and each of them worked up to within days of their deaths. So they were here for over 30 years and worked almost until they died. Mary Otilda Gosley was widely known as Tilly Gosley, and she was a librarian in Evansville for decades. She was born in 1842 here in Evansville and educated in private schools. She was hired as a librarian for the Evansville Library in 1873. Now, this was a small subscription library, which meant that the only people who could use it were people who paid a fee to use it. It wasn't open to the public and free. But when the Willard Library opened in 1885, the books of that library, as well as its librarian, moved here. Although early on, the Board of Trustees reportedly wanted to hire a male librarian to take charge of the collection, this never happened, or when it did happen, it was decades later. Tilly became the head librarian, and she was so well known that One History, published in 1919, included her biography among those of other prominent residents of Evansville. And you see a couple of paragraphs from that biography here on this slide. Tilly lived in the family home at 511 Upper 2nd Street, and I'm not sure which house this is because I believe the streets have been renumbered, but I think the house is still there. She died there in 1919. Now, she was so well known that she merited a bolded listing in the Evansville Street Directory. And the listing shown here for 1896 shows that she was living with her widowed mother. If you look at the very first one, that's her mother, Anna Gosley. Tilly regularly had a bolded heading in the annual directory indicating her importance. Tilly's brother, his wife Kate, and their daughter Margaret are also listed here, but they're not in big letters. They lived outside the city limits on Kentucky Avenue in Lincoln. And Margaret apparently moved in with Tilly after her parents died. Just before Tilly herself died, she sold Margaret the family home for $1. So. Tilly Gosley was described as a petite woman who habitually dressed in black, although if this photograph correctly identifies the 3 women at the back as the Willards librarians, none of them are dressed all in black. She was known for her warm and welcoming persona, and people who attended St. Paul's Episcopal Church with her called her Aunt Tilly. She had no formal training as a librarian, but she was praised for being highly knowledgeable about the library's collection. However, what more people noted was her charming personality, which made people feel welcome in the library. Tilly Gosley died at home on October 3rd, 1919, after a month-long illness. And the local press ran lengthy obituary notices. And this is actually twice the size, but if I had put the entire thing on there, the print would have been way too small. Like this one from the Evansville Press, they emphasized her ladylike character, calling her cultivated and charming. She was the woman who had served the library since its opening day on March 28, 1885. She especially loved young people, and her colleague, Catherine Imbush, was quoted as saying, "What a pity it was that she had died just as the, quote, jolly young college students," end quote, were coming in. And this is actually a reference to the fact that Evansville College opened that year. It had moved here from Cincinnati, and it opened here as Evansville College. Throughout her long career, Tilly walked to work every day. She ate lunch nearby with Miss Imbush within sight of the library. Her whole life was bound up in the library, so it's possible she's revisiting it after her death, just to make sure that everything is running smoothly. However, if she is the Gray Lady, there is a nearly 20-year gap between the time she died and the first sighting in 1937. So it may be that the Gray Lady is Gosley's longtime colleague, Catherine Imbush, whose death was closer to that first appearance. Catherine Imbush took a different path to becoming a librarian, but she also became famous enough to have a biographical listing in the history of Vanderburgh County, published in 1922. And here you see the first paragraph, which states that she had been employed at the library for 27 years. And this is correct, she was first hired in 1896. Although the obituary of Tilly Gosley emphasized Tilly's charming culture, this history points to the intellectual and administrative demands of being the head librarian. Yet Catherine Imbush, known as Katie, had no background in library work when she was hired in the 1890s. Now, that is actually not surprising, and it's not unique to this library, since at that time, library schools were just being founded, and many people viewed librarians, especially female librarians, more like hostesses who had to create a calm and welcoming atmosphere rather than library professionals. The idea that librarians were a type of hostess may help to explain how Katie Imbush got hired as a librarian. When she was 20 years old in 1880, she started working as a sales lady at the popular candy store on Main Street run by Henry Herman. And here you see a photo of that candy store in 1880 when she started working there. She continued working there as a sales lady until 1896. And according to a story told by Katie herself, one day in the shop, she heard two customers, who just happened to be Willard Library trustees, discussing the need to hire an assistant librarian. She somehow persuaded them to present her name to the library's board, and she was hired. She started work here on September 1st, 1896. Now, there are many similarities between Tilly Gosley and Katie Imbush, because both worked at the Willard Library for decades, in fact, for 34 years, each of them. Each served as head librarian. Both remained unmarried and lived in their family homes until they died. Both died in their homes after decades of service to the library. Both walked work, although Katie Imbush only lived 2 blocks from the library and Tilly Gosley lived much farther away. Each served the Willard Library for nearly 35 years. And this drawing shows you where Katie Imbush would have lived, and you can see how close that is to the Willard Library. But in 1922, Katie and the library came in for scathing criticism from the Secretary of the Public Library Commission of Indiana. He critiqued the library's book purchasing process, its allegedly slipshod care of books and periodicals, and the lack of subject headings in the catalog. And no, I'm sure the librarians over here are like, no subject headings, no. He suggested that Katie Imbush was not capable of making necessary changes to address these issues, since she had no formal training in librarianship, and he recommended hiring somebody with better qualifications, and I suspect he recommended hiring a man with better qualifications. In response, the Willard trustees raised Miss Imbush's salary $10 a month. However, in 1926, the board also appointed a board member, Sarah Denton, to be assistant librarian, and she likely began to make changes to align the library with professional standards. We don't know how these two women got along, but they worked together for 4 years until Katie Imbush died in 1930. And this is a picture of Katie Imbush in the library in 1926. She's kind of hidden back there behind the card catalog. And for those of you who are too young to know what a card catalog is, it's a precursor to a computer. Sarah Denton became the head librarian. So, like Tilly Gosley, Catherine Imbush served the Willard Library virtually until her death. And let's now take a look at how her death was treated in the press. This is it. Even though the members of the Board of Trustees praised Catherine Imbush for her courteous and gracious manner, when she died in 1930, notices of her passing were far more limited than those that had been published at the time of Tilly Gosley's death. And remember, she had died just over a decade earlier. This notice is the longest one published in Evansville newspapers. There are 1 or 2 ones that were like this long, and this is the longest of them. Little is said about her character or about her contribution to the library, other than the fact that she worked there for 34 years. In fact, from this notice, you would never know that she had been the head librarian for a decade. So, when it comes to the Gray Lady, I have to admit that my choice of who it is Catherine Imbush. First, there are problems with some of the other proposed candidates. There are no reports of a woman's tragic death on or near this location before the library was built, as suggested by the Warrens. And there's no evidence of a lovelorn woman committing suicide in the Wabash and Early Canal, as described by folklorist Wanda Willis. Second, the activity in the library is gentle, which seems to rule out the vengeful spirit of Louise Carpenter. If she wanted the library to close, why wouldn't she scare off the patrons? Appear like the at the beginning of Ghostbusters, where the librarian turns into this fiend, you know. Instead, we should consider the two librarians who spent decades of their lives working here every day, almost to the day that they died. Both of them were born in the mid-19th century, and paranormal experts suggest that ghosts can choose how they appear. So why not appear as a young woman in 19th century dress rather than as an elderly lady? I tend to favor Catherine Imbush over Tilly Gosley for two reasons. First, Catherine died in 1930, only 7 years before the first reported sighting of the Gray Lady, while Tilly Gosley had been dead for 18 years in 1937. Of course, it could be the apparitions appeared when there was nobody there to see them. If a ghost appears and there's nobody to see it, does that mean that there is no ghost? So dates of sightings aren't proof. But there's another factor, and I have to say it's a question of remembrance. When Tilly Gosley died, the local press published these lengthy reminiscences of her. But when Catherine Imbush died, the newspapers barely acknowledged her passing. Is it possible that Catherine returns because she wants her long years of service and leadership to be remembered? Or is the Gray Lady somebody else whose connection to the Willard Library has yet to be identified? Until the Gray Lady tells us who she is, we're going to have to keep guessing. Thank you.